Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This has been a long day, but in many ways, this is really always the most interesting part of our webinar sessions because it gives all of you a chance to uh, participate yourselves, to speak with each other, to ask questions of us and our group, talk a little bit about your projects. I hope that each of you will be thinking of things that you might want to ask or talk about what you're doing. We've called this panel 10 Things to Watch for over the next several months. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more than 10 things. Um, but what we spent the entire day, of course, talking about what is coverage worthy in the region and nationally in terms of criminal justice. But we wanted to just go a bit further and sort of look forward into some larger issues. I was just saying to Judge Lerner Wren that what she left us with that the mental health courts and CITs are only steps along the way. I mean, they're not the answers to the questions of mental health. The next, really, the harder issue, the harder thing to look at, to cover, is what needs to be changing systemically in the area of mental health. And in many of the other areas we've talked about, whether it's tribal justice, navigating reentry, the same thing approaches, the same thing applies. So what I wanted to start with, we have Katti with us and also Professor Luna as our facilitators. But what I wanted to do is ask each of we have three speakers to talk about what they see looking further ahead than tomorrow and next week, some of the key issues, the systemic issues that you guys should be looking at and thinking about. And then we'll throw it open to everyone. So really pleased to have with us some really excellent speakers noted nationally. We have Deanna Hoskins of Just Leadership USA. We have John Gould, who's director of the School of Criminology at ASU. We have Vikrant Reddy from the Koch Institute. All of them are noted speakers in their own right. They're people who look ahead. So we wanted to start and ask them to look ahead a bit and give us each about 10 or 12 minutes of what they're thinking, and then we'll all dive in and start our roundtable. So perhaps we can start with Deanna. Uh, Deanna's bio is going to be listed on your chat room, which is also the larger bio is available, as we've said, on the site. So, Deanna, let me start with you, and then we'll go to John, and then Vikrant.
Thank you, everyone. So I really want to get to it, talking about the 10 things to look at. But I think to set the background, we know this past year has seen unprecedented stories documenting changes in American society since the Trump administration, from the Texas storms jeopardizing the lives of hundreds of thousands of incarcerated people to voter suppression tactics in the run-up to the election of Joe Biden. To effectively cover criminal justice in 2021, we have to address racial justice in 2021. We can't cover this without talking and speaking to that. And at Just Leadership, we hold the oppressive systems as a continuation of the racial discrimination. And our goal is to educate, elevate, and empower the voices of directly impacted people in dismantling those systems. So here are 10 issues that news media and different people need to pay attention to in 2021. One is, how bold is this administration willing to be? Are they bold enough to appoint a directly impacted individual to a position in the office, such as a criminal justice or reentry czar within the Office of Policy Counsel? Two, there's a growing push to end solitary confinement on the state and federal level that must be covered in depth by the news media. In 2019, nearly 30 states introduced legislation to ban or restrict solitary confinement, and 12 states have passed such reforms. We know that research has showed us that the trauma that is associated with solitary confinement, that nearly 80% of the people in federal prison, almost 60% in state, are there for drug offenses, and actually solitary confinement and the trauma associated is never addressed. When I get down to 3, one of the more needs to be told on how our legal system rests on the shoulders of prosecutors, who have been given enormous power to decide what changes to pursue, and how we're going to actually address that portion of the criminal justice system to actually impact individuals' lives. A lot of times prosecutors don't focus on individuals with mental health, with trauma, substance abuse as they're entering the criminal justice system. 4, what we've seen with COVID and the Texas storms, it clear needs to have emergency preparedness. We discovered at the height of COVID that correctional facilities and jails do not have to have emergency preparedness plans to preserve the lives of individuals entering their system, as hospitals, colleges, schools, business buildings have fire drills and different things. There's not a plan in place to actually preserve, which is why we started to see the impact that we saw. So when I get down to 5, similarly, in response to the reports of the Federal Bureau of Prison and state prison health and safety violations, Senator Duckworth has actually introduced a bill that has actually came to a stall that actually preserves the lives of those individuals in the jail. That is really worth paying attention to from a media standpoint on how BOP is actually responding to COVID of the people that are mandated to their custody and care as well. 6, I have a huge ask to the media to change the way they write and talk about directly impacted people. We all know that words matter, but some of the terms that journalists continue to use about currently and formerly incarcerated people dehumanizes them and denies them their basic human dignity. The population needs to be referred to as people, people on parole, people recently released from prison, people with criminal convictions. What we also saw is that individuals who have criminal background, even in their death, their criminal background as if to almost justify their murders or different things that happen. 7, we also need the media to focus on the disparities facing individuals convicted of drug felonies. The lifetime ban on formerly incarcerated people convicted of these felonies around SNAP and TANF benefits, which food is a basic human need, dehumanizes them and continues to punish them in some kind of way of not being worthy of meeting basic human needs. Similarly, journalists must increase their coverage on the discretionary bans on public housing for people with criminal backgrounds. Again, housing is a human right, a human basic need, but there are actually exclusion bans across this country that actually prevent people with criminal records, whether it's drug offenses or different things, from accessing that basic human need of housing. 9, we haven't seen much coverage on the historical landmark on the restoration of Pell Grants for incarcerated people. When we know education is a recidivism reduction plan, we haven't seen that highlighted or elevated in media as being newsworthy, that actually there's been a major landmark historic restoration of Pell Grants inside correctional facility to ensure people return to our community to be able to be thriving, productive members of society. So we would like to say that. And 10, finally, a greater need and wider discussion on the harms caused by the 94 crime bill and the urgent need to repeal that. We're talking mass incarceration, we're talking all these things, but one of the foundational laws that created that is the 94 crime bill, and we're not touching it. We're just actually saying, here are some incremental steps that need to happen to give people a better life. Well, there's one bill that created and set the foundation for all of this, but we're not even addressing that bill or demanding that that bill is repealed to actually start restoring the lives to individuals. We need more humanizing stories that people who have been hurt by this bill, included the voices of directly impacted. We need to elevate that people who have made a mistake in their lives actually have the ability to change the trajectory of their lives, and not only change it, but to be valuable expertise in how we move forward at this point. That is not being highlighted enough. I am not the worst thing that I've ever done. I think I've made a mistake. I've paid my debt to society, and I've actually become a productive member of society in how we address this issue to reduce the further harms of future generations moving forward. And I'll stop there.
That's great, Deanna. That's 6 months worth of fantastic stories there. It's a city editor's dream. Thank you very much. Let's move to Professor Gould. Can you maybe drill down a bit to sort of regional stories as well as national?
Certainly, and Steve, it's nice to meet you finally, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Hello from the Southwest, where it's a little bit warmer than the rest of the country today. It's a pleasure to be here. I also have 10 stories or 10 ideas of things to follow. Some of these are a little bit more regional to the Southwest, and I think one of the advantages of going late in the day is I probably get to say me too to a number of things that have already been raised today. So we'll see whether I have anything novel here or if I'm just preaching to the choir. But in any event, let me start with the number one question I get from reporters. And I get called probably twice a week to comment on things, whether it's in Phoenix, which is where I'm based, or stories across the country. The number one story I get called about is changing crime rates as a result of COVID. Now, here's what we know. We know that things have changed. We don't know if these are long-lasting trends, and we are not sure yet whether it's a result of COVID or not. We know that murder is up in a number of places and that interpersonal violence is up. We know that crimes against property are generally down. We can make some suppositions about that, but as I keep telling reporters over and over again, and of course this is not what any of you want to hear, we're not sure yet, and so I don't want to be quoted as saying, of course it's definitively this. However, in 2021, we're likely to have more research done and be able to say more about the changing trends that we've seen, whether they're temporary, whether they're permanent, and the extent to which they're related to COVID. So that's number one. Number two, of course, the big story in 2020 was issues of racial fairness in the criminal justice system. Coming from the Southwest, the thing that we need to be adding to that conversation is it's not just race, it's ethnicity, it's citizenship, it's language. And so a story or stories that we ought to be looking at, particularly out of places like Phoenix, Tucson, anywhere in Texas, New Mexico, Southern California, would be the extent to which Latino or Hispanic suspects or individuals end up getting identified more often and whether they get worse treatment in the system. We believe they do. It's a story that's not been written about as much as I think it should be. Third, let me throw something out there that's probably not been talked about as much today. That's the future of the death penalty. The death penalty has been used a whole lot less recently, even in Arizona. I looked at the Arizona numbers recently in 2020, almost unrecognizable to what we've seen in the state before. And notwithstanding President Trump's mad rush at the end of his administration to execute people on federal death row, I think as of today, there's almost no one on federal death row that has a death warrant that's scheduled. So we are seeing many fewer crimes in which prosecutors are charging capitally, many fewer people being sentenced to death row, and many fewer death sentences being carried out. So it begs the question, is the death penalty on its way out? President Biden has promised to do away with it, at least at the federal level. Will we see him do it? More importantly, if we reach the point in a number of states, including those that we associate with using the death penalty a lot, that they are simply done with it, at least in practice. Fourth would be alternatives to policing. I am sure this has been talked about today. We are beginning to see it in places like Denver and Phoenix, where rather than sending police officers out on certain calls, they're sending social workers. This really is a game changer in terms of both fiscal uses of taxpayer dollars, also reducing the likelihood that there will be some sort of an altercation between someone who has a weapon and is a sworn officer and a suspect. So that's something to keep an eye on. As long as we are on the topic of police oversight will be big in 2021. At least in Phoenix, this is a fight that we are seeing right now between a number of people in the community and the police and some folks on the city council as to whether there really will be a citizens review board and whether police will be held accountable for some of their behavior. Watch this story. I have no idea how it's going to play out in a number of jurisdictions. You would think that this would be hot and that a number of places would be instituting civilian oversight. If Phoenix is a guide, we don't yet know. Next story up would be alternatives to incarceration. One of the things that we've seen in a number of jurisdictions as a result of COVID is trying to find some other alternative than putting someone into prison or into jail where they are likely to be exposed to COVID and where the expenses to the system are likely to skyrocket, not to mention the health of the suspect being put at risk. So we've seen many, many more suspects find some sort of alternative arrangement, either from prosecutors or from courts. It suggests that it's possible to do this without severely affecting the crime rate poorly. Another thing to be following as we go forward. Next one up, I mentioned earlier that at least in the Southwest, we don't think of disproportionate sentencing or disproportionate treatment as simply being about race. We also talk about ethnicity, but one group that really does not get a whole lot of treatment that deserves a lot greater treatment is the treatment of Native Americans at the hands of the criminal justice system. There have been some very good stories in 2020 about how COVID has affected the Native American tribes and how the government has or has not responded. We've seen a whole lot less about how they are treated in the state's criminal justice system and the federal criminal justice system. I think this would be a really interesting story to look at some of the disproportionalities and to explore why those occur. So I think, and also it's got the nice legs that it's on top of the COVID story. So you have disproportionality of Native Americans in COVID. Well, let's talk about what happens when they're in the criminal justice system. Nearing the end of my list here, being a border state, we deal a great deal with the federal courts and how they are handling cases of alleged illegal entry into the United States. One of the things that was suggested to me by the federal public defender in Phoenix is to take a look at the rates at which federal courts are processing these cases. There is at least an allegation that in Phoenix, these cases are being processed at a much higher rate, or actually I should say in the state of Arizona, than they are being in Texas, which means that people who hit the border at Arizona are much more likely to be sent back more quickly with fewer opportunities to plead their case than they are at other points on the border, for example, California or Texas. I don't know whether it's true. As I said, it's been suggested to me, but it's a great story to look into. And finally, anyone who's read anything I've ever written knows that I cannot close anything that I say without mentioning the problem of indigent defense. We talk about it so often that I think people just accept that poor indigent defense is just part of the American criminal justice system. It's consistent with the way we do business. It's not. It violates the 6th Amendment. It violates the 14th Amendment. And we ought to be paying more attention to this. I think the story to be asking in 2021 is not a descriptive story about why it occurs. It's an exploratory story about why it happens. And I think the story that has not been told that deserves more attention is the fact that this is a result of decisions of judges and particularly policy organizations of judges, for example, the United States Judicial Conference. I think you can draw a line right back to groups like that in terms of why this problem has not been fixed. And I'd love to see some stories that explore that. So with that, I will be quiet and thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here. Steve, you're on mute.
Good, yes. These are great. John, thank you very much. The latest city, in fact, to think about diverting police budgets happens to be Austin. I just saw a story today about deciding to divert some of the budget in Austin to mental health services. So it continues apace in the region as well. So let me move to Vikrant to talk a little bit about, from his perspective, what are the stories that bear watching over the next few months?
Sure. Well, one of the disadvantages of going third is that when you have a list of terrific ideas, they get stolen by really brilliant people like John and Deanna. So here's what I think I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on one story on my list that I think is particularly important, but it has a lot of dimensions that I think are rich for reporters to investigate, and I'm going to get into that. I'm going to start talking about this by asking, what's the big criminal justice story that everybody's following right now, literally today, this week? Well, it's the trial of Derek Chauvin up in Minnesota. Now, I think it would be a tragedy if after the trial ends, everybody sort of forgets about the death of George Floyd and moves on to other kinds of stories. What I want reporters to think about is, what is the real structural issue here that is worth keeping your eye on throughout the entire year, probably for several years to come, actually, that you should be investigating in your jurisdiction that ties into a broader national narrative? And that issue is why police officers have conversations with people in the first place. It's what I would call the connection between overcriminalization and policing. We ask police officers to do all kinds of things. A lot of them are just not really within a police officer's skill set. We ask them, understandably, to appear whenever there's a serious issue of violence taking place. Fair enough. But we also ask police officers to show up whenever there's a mental health crisis. We also ask police officers to show up whenever there are episodes of homelessness. We ask police officers to show up for drug overdoses. Police officers are asked to intervene in all kinds of social ills. And probably one of the hottest areas of discussion and debate in the academic community right now is this concept of what some people might call unbundling the police or disaggregating the police function. There are a lot of different words for this. And what people are asking is, what is it that the police are really for? Let's focus the limited time and resources that police officers have on those things. And let's find other ways to handle these other kinds of social ills. Let's find other kinds of ways to handle mental health crises and homelessness and drug addiction. Now, it's complicated. There are some ways in which I think just the laws that get passed in the first place don't need to get passed, and no police officer or any social service worker or anybody really needs to have the conversation. Probably the best example of this is something like the Erik Garner case up in New York. Everybody remembers that Erik Garner was selling loose cigarettes on the corner in Staten Island. Police officers came up to him, and as I opened my comments with, they had a conversation with him. It became an adversarial conversation. Conversations with police officers tend to become adversarial. He got put in a chokehold and he died. We had a big national discussion. We should continue to have this discussion about chokeholds and about the kinds of techniques that police officers use. But what wasn't discussed enough was the question of why it's illegal to sell loose cigarettes on the corner in New York. Why did the legislature have to pass that law? What kinds of laws get passed by legislatures unnecessarily that prompt all kinds of adversarial interactions with law enforcement? That's something that I really hope that reporters will dig into, this issue of overcriminalization. Now, there are other kinds of things where the questions get a little bit more complicated. One of the more difficult areas is domestic violence. I don't know that police officers are very good marriage counselors. It's not necessarily a good idea for them to show up and get and effectively resolve a domestic violence, a marital conflict. On the other hand, there are an extraordinary number of cases where police officers show up and there's some marriage altercation taking place and somebody draws a gun and it becomes a violent situation. And the idea that just a psychologist can show up and handle that problem, I don't know that it's quite that simple. There are ways in which you probably have to have law enforcement involved, but you probably have to figure out how to have law enforcement involved in I would say, a smarter way. A way in which they can come in and better de-escalate situations on the front end rather than perhaps escalating what's already kind of a heated, violent environment. So it's difficult. There's a lot to think about there. There is the fact that in the United States, unlike a lot of other countries, we have a lot of firearms in circulation. So it's understandable that you may want a police officer to handle a certain kind of problem in the US that they might not be asked to handle in Japan, for example. There's a lot to unpack there, but I'm not sure that we're far enough along in understanding the full scope of the problem because we just don't have enough reporting on it. What I really want reporters to focus on is what's happening. What is the original nature of these incidents? We know these names. I mean, it's really tragic that I could just rattle off a list of names and everybody immediately sees the faces and the stories. If I say Tamir Rice, if I say Sandra Bland, if I say Erik Garner, if I say Michael Brown. But let's really dig deep into why these people had interactions with law enforcement in the first place. And let's ask ourselves whether or not those initial contacts could have been avoided to begin with. Sometimes they could not have been. But in many cases, maybe they could have been. And I think more reporting about that is going to help inform the way that academics and policymakers are thinking about policy changes moving forward. That really, at the end of the day, I'll close with this, Stephen, is there's kind of in my judgment, sort of a silly version of the defund the police idea. And then there's a kind of smart, interesting, thoughtful version. The silly version is just not giving police officers any money when they're obviously a critical and important part of society. But the more smart, thoughtful, interesting version is saying, you know, we really want the police officers to focus the money we give them on violent crime. We want to take some portion of the funds and instead figure out mental health, drug addiction, homelessness, and other problems like this in a smart way. That I think is a conversation worth having in a much more deep and engaged way.
Thank you, Vikrant. And of course, you know, since you mentioned the Chauvin trial, the question remains is, do we need a policeman to be there about a $20 counterfeit bill? I mean, that's probably one of the key questions. I know that Deanna wants to make some comments, but I also want to invite my facilitator colleagues also to jump in when they feel the need, and also to the rest of our journalist fellows. Please raise your hand if you have a question or if you have a comment you want to make. The floor will be open to you as well. So let me go to Deanna, and then I think maybe Erik looks like he has something to say, and then we'll move on.
So I wanted to follow up because Vikrant brought up some very important key issues. And when we talk about, you know, the legislative that is being put in place about the loose cigarettes and different things, again, it goes back to my earlier comment about you can't talk about racial justice, right? The bigger question is, why do 13 million people come in contact with law enforcement for misdemeanor crimes that we consider low-level crimes? So when you think about Sandra Bland, George Floyd, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Timothy Thomas in Ohio, they all were stopped for misdemeanor charges, but lost their life. They weren't stopped for the thought of being convicted or accused of a murder or anything of that nature. Why in this country, and we know misdemeanor charges came as the end at the abolishment of slavery to still arrest people to exploit them for their labor. So why in this country are misdemeanor charges still being heavily on the books? Every year, 13 million people are actually stopped for misdemeanor charges. And it has become a tool that is justified in deaths of individuals. All a police officer has to claim is, I fear for my life. Qualified immunity comes in. So we are actually hosting on April 21st a viewing that talks about misdemeanor charges and the connection to slavery and how Black and brown people are losing their lives from that level of intervention or interaction with law enforcement that most people in society say, oh, that's a minor charge. It's not minor when your life ends with that interaction. So why are those policies in place? I'm with Vikrant. Why are those policies in place that you couldn't sell cigarettes on the street corner? That I had to stop you and intervene in some kind of way? Sam Dubose, I stopped you because you didn't have a front license plate. But then the legislator came and said, it's legal in Ohio not to have a front license plate after he lost his life for that minor traffic stop. So I think this is deeper than just looking at, you know, why people are being stopped. We need to go to the core issue of why misdemeanor charges or misdemeanor crimes are on the books when they're a historical connection from slavery.
Thank you, Deanna. Send us a link for that viewing if you can. We'll spread it around. We have one question.
Steve, I want to just trail Deanna on this because this is a story that's been in my mind in this midst of whatever kind of racial reprogramming is going on, if that's a question. The notion of the Black behemoth in the white mind, and particularly in the minds of white law enforcement, like that's some sort of like big thought piece perhaps, but I think that's really critical to this discussion, to these discussions of reform in this moment. Just the psychology that prompts, you see a Black body and that Black body represents this whole other thing. And the flip side of that, as even Black on Black crime is surging, and I'm speaking as someone who, you know, also covers health and mental health, the psychology even of that. I think there are all these stories, however they enter this fear, that are about what's in our heads, you know, what's in our heads. But yeah, I'm riffing. I'm in the newsroom now, and we're just talking story ideas. And I have some other ideas I want to share with the journalists, but I know there are questions that are popping up. Steve, you're on mute.
Yeah. Erik, it looks like you have something to say, and then I'm going to move to
Great. You know, I
Nikki
had a
Roberts. She's got
question
a
for all
comment.
the panelists. I had a question for all the panelists. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of the range of politically acceptable reforms that can be done to the criminal justice system. Policy wonks sometimes call this an Overton window. It's based on various constituencies all chiming in on a particular issue. Have things shifted greatly such that things that were unthinkable in terms of reforms or changes in the past are now actually quite thinkable? So that's one question. And then the back end of that, or you could just answer this second part, is this: do you foresee, or are you seeing a pushback from the law enforcement community or other groups in terms of criminal justice reforms that have been proposed and have been pushed in the past few years, but also in the past few months?
So I'm going to widen that question a bit. I want to, while you're thinking about answering that, I want to bring in Nikki Roberts, but also who has a question that is sort of on the same area. So Nikki, I'm going to allow you to talk. You can put your video on, and then you can answer Nikki's point as well as answering Erik's point as well. Nikki, over to you.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, you can put your video on
Okay.
if you'd like.
I don't, but
Okay.
I'm glad to have an audible connection to this great space that's been so informative and empowering for me as a justice involved advocate. So my question is for Deanna, and it can be broadened, but for people who have experienced confinement, is it more effective to encourage entrepreneurship for their economic mobility, or should there be more policies to encourage second chance employment?
Oh, thank you for that question. That's a really good question. One
And
of the
if you can
things
also
that
answer Erik's question as well, we'll move around to the political side of it.
I always push for, I don't like focusing on second chance employment. I like focusing on employment opportunities, right? Because when you start saying second chance housing, second chance employment, you're still outlining us as being different and not being inclusive of being a productive member of society. We do push entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship is a spirit as well, right? I could still be in somebody's working with an organization or working with someone, and my entrepreneurial spirit comes out in how I do that work and how I live. If we start pushing for entrepreneurial, that means we have to push for more opportunities of funding for those individuals to do their small business startups and different things of that nature. So there's other elements that go to that, but I think it all should be broadened, and that the person should make the choice of where they want to go and have that opportunity to go in either lane that's there. I do want to.
Yeah, the question is whether just to follow up on Erik's point, whether the political climate is conducive to that and what you need to do to achieve that.
Yeah, so I do think the political climate is conducive, Erik, but here's one of the things I always want to share with people. When legislation starts in the states regionally and it bubbles up to the federal government, it kind of puts pressure on the federal government. So think about same-sex marriage, marijuana legalization, right? But when it comes from the federal government down, it always gets overturned. There is, I think, the political parties and the pushback. Democrats are pushing for more like legalizing marijuana, right? Alternatives to incarceration, more employment opportunities. We just saw the American Jobs Plan, which is going to create more infrastructure employment with federal funds, but also they have to follow it up by adopting a fair hiring policy that hold contractors to federal who receive those federal dollars to do the highways, the bridges, to hire more individuals, as Nikki talked about, who have those criminal backgrounds. So I do think the political climate is there in this. We're in a moment. I keep saying we have 18 months to the next election, 2022. I think we're back up in a bubble again where everything can change. So what are the things we can do right now while we're in this moment? But what are the rooted issues of that? We can push legislation as incremental, But why not address the 94 crime bill? Why not address the fact of these misdemeanors? Why we have an opportunity for bipartisanship of whatever the majority party is.
Vikrant or John, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. So I'm usually a pessimist about these kinds of things, but I'm an optimist about reform, Erik, actually, and I'll give you 3 reasons why I'm an optimist. So first of all, let's start with the Democrats. They obviously have got a lot of internal pressure within their political coalition to act big time on criminal justice reform. You talk to any left of center voter these days, it's easily within their top 3 issues. For so many of them, it is number 1 right now. So the interests within that party are clear. I probably don't have to talk too much about that. Everybody understands it. Second one I'll talk a bit more about, that's the interests of Republicans. Now, you may assume, well, this is a Democratic issue, it's not really a Republican one, we're gonna have to work hard to get the Republicans on board. I'm not so sure I see it that way. On election day last year, November 3rd, the state of New Jersey voted to legalize recreational marijuana. A lot of people are going, well, you know, that's New Jersey, that's a very blue state, that's to be expected. Sure. But the voters that same night in South Dakota and Montana, and for that matter, Arizona, where several of you are right now, which is more of a purple state, they all voted to legalize recreational marijuana too. These are very Republican states. In fact, here's a very, very Republican state. In 2016, in Oklahoma, a referendum passed on election night that took a whole bunch of drug crimes that were classified as felonies and reclassified them as misdemeanors, which means that it brought down the amount of years that people who are convicted of these crimes would serve big time. This happened in Oklahoma on the night that Donald Trump was elected president. And Oklahoma was the 3rd Trumpiest, if that's a word, state in the country. Numbers 1 and 2 in terms of percentage of voters who voted for Mr. Trump were, it's West Virginia and Wyoming. I don't remember in which order, what was 1 and what was 2. But number 3 was Oklahoma. It was these voters that were voting for new drug policy in the country. I'm not 100% sure what's behind that, but my very, very strong guess is that it's connected to the opioid epidemic. And the fact that everybody in the country, whether you're left or right, knows somebody struggling with a drug problem right now. Just because you're a Republican doesn't mean that you're insulated from it. You've probably got a family member who's dealing with this issue. So everybody, I think, is in the mood for a big, big rethink on drug policy, and that means a big rethink on criminal justice policy. Here's the 3rd thing I'll say, and then I'll stop and turn over to you, John. That is that most criminal justice in this country, and therefore most criminal justice reform, happens at the state level, not the federal level. And that's a good thing, because federal politics are kind of toxic. That stuff is very easily caricatured on late night cable TV shows. It gets people's dander up. It's very difficult to have civil, reasoned conversations about the criminal justice at that level. But the founders, in all their wisdom, insisted that a whole lot of issues, and criminal justice is one of them, as much as possible, need to be kind of delegated down to the state level and then even the local level whenever they can be. Those conversations are easier. I'm not saying they're easy, don't misunderstand me. You still get into big time fights in Albany and Sacramento and Austin, but they don't show up on Sean Hannity's TV show or on Rachel Maddow's TV show quite as often as the Washington, D.C. fights do. You, in many cases, know the people involved in these arguments. You may see them at the grocery store. They're your neighbors. You know their culture. If you live in Arizona, you may be skeptical of the folks up in Vermont, but you're not necessarily skeptical of other Arizonans quite as much. It can be a little bit easier to have civil conversations about these things. And so I think it's a positive sign that we're talking about more of a state and local issue with criminal justice than we are a federal issue. For all 3 of those reasons, Democratic coalition politics, the Republican interest in drug policy, probably due to the opioid epidemic, and the fact that this is more of a state and local issue. I'm a bit of an optimist on the prospects for criminal justice reform.
John, over to you.
Well, so I'm sometimes accused of looking at something like this, although I guess it's less than half full right now, but I'm sometimes accused of looking at the glass and saying it is half empty as opposed to half full. This time, in answer to this question, I would say we're actually just about at the middle point. So I think there's good reason to be optimistic, and there are reasons to be worried at the same time. So the reasons to be optimistic is we've seen criminal justice reform most recently, and we've seen it in states like Arizona. So we recently in Arizona, this is with a Republican legislature and a Republican governor. They passed legislation to keep criminal records from being in the hands of people who could use it against someone for employment. We banned the box before, and we're seeing it in a number of other jurisdictions around the country. And I agree that this is an issue in which those on the left and those on the right can find common cause if the issue is framed as what should be the scope of the state's interest here. How big should the footprint of the state be in its penal powers? That's something where I think the libertarian right has, in the last several years, become active in trying to reduce what we criminalize. And certainly those on the left are concerned about the way that gets operationalized. So I think there's reason to be optimistic there. I still believe the arguments that are going to have the greatest political support will be those that tie back to money, how much tax dollars are being spent, and the extent to which things do or do not make us safer. To the extent that we are in a period where crime rates are low, it's going to be a whole lot easier to have this conversation. But if crime rates begin to go up a little bit, it's going to be even more, it's not going to be quite so optimistic as we go forward. The other thing that I would say that gives me some pause is I talk to criminal justice officials often. I talk to police officers, I talk to correctional officers. And their response to these horrific acts that we see profiled daily in the news is essentially to say, well, that's about bad apples. That's about bad actors. That's not about me. I really don't like being tarred with all of this that you're covering on these stories. And while that may be true in some individual instances, I think the great danger here is it has us then not talking about the structural issues in criminal justice, then end up with these disproportionalities in terms of who gets targeted, how they're treated, how they're sentenced, and the like. And so that's where if I'm going to be a little bit half empty and looking at that glass, it's going to be that we will end up focusing on the low-hanging fruit, have a tendency to look at the individual actors of individual officers and not consider, as we ought to, the structural issues that lend to disproportionalities and unequal criminal justice system.
So one of the most interesting exercises anywhere in the country in the past year has been in Tucson, which conducted what they call the Tucson Sentinel Event Review Board on the death of, I can't remember his name now, but it was one of the most interesting elements because it looked at going beyond blaming a bad apple for the death of a civilian, but looking at some of the key roots of mistakes and flaws inside the criminal justice system. And I wonder whether that approach, and anyone can answer this, is another way of looking at how we cover criminal justice.
Oh, absolutely. So this has been pushed for years. Actually, one of my colleagues, Mike Scott, was one of the people who did that trauma, that did the Sentinel Events Review in Tucson. This has been pushed by the Department of Justice since early in the Obama years. It's a fairly simple model. It's the National Transportation Safety Board's approach to failures in the criminal justice system. There are two keys to this to make it work. Number one is what you define as a failure. So certainly a police shooting is an easy one to identify as a failure. But should we be looking at disproportionalities in sentencing, where we know that African-American suspects get sentenced at a higher rate than do their white counterparts? That's a failure. It's not one that typically gets addressed. The other piece is this notion that it has to be a non-blaming inquiry. It's almost like an autopsy, or again, the NTSB, where they go to look at why a plane crashed. The point isn't to figure out whether we sue the airliner or whether we sue the manufacturer. The point is to prevent a plane from crashing again. Same thing here. We want to prevent future police shootings. We want to prevent other failures in the criminal justice system. But it has to be a process that is non-blaming. Otherwise, you are not going to get the various actors to participate. If we can get them to participate, it's an interesting story simply that they're participating, but I do wonder, I'm going to push this back on the journalist a little bit. I do wonder whether that's a sexy enough story to cover. All right, they go and they do this analysis. They come up with 3 to 5 reasons why there was a problem. It's a blue ribbon task force kind of story. Those things don't get the kind of attention that he did this to him kind of do. So I do wonder whether, well, let me put it this way. It's superb policy. Is it a hot story? Probably not.
Well, let me throw that out to the journalist then, because I think that's a very good point. Although if you find out that it was somebody who put a file in the wrong place, and that's what got a wrongful conviction, I think that's as interesting a story as the bad apple.
Yeah, but Steve, you're immediately turning that into who is responsible for it,
right,
as opposed to being, because Sentinel Events is about systems. It's what's wrong in the system, not what this individual did, but what about a system has it so that a person could have done that.
that's a good point.
And you know what? Following up on that, what John said, that goes to when we talk about recidivism, right? It's always deficit based on the individual. It's never taking a look at what caused the recidivism. Was it technical violation, a condition of? It always is on the failure of the person and not the failure of the system. But I'm with John, looking at what led to it. Was it technical violations, outdated rules in that specific state, or different things of that nature? I'm with John. That's not a sexy enough story. It's sexy to say that the person was released from prison 30 days ago and they've recidivated already, right? It's all the blame is on the person. But actually, what caused that? And we never get to the core of that. Even around crime, when people are on trial, we never get to what led that person to commit this crime. We actually just charge the crime.
So
I want to, Steve, can I jump in? I know
Okay.
because this always is the more difficult part, because the journalists are not going to talk about stories because they don't want journalists stealing their stories. So I want to offer some story ideas, and I would love it if the panelists would weigh in. And so these are the stories that sort of occur to me in this moment that I have no problem giving away. One is the very construct of prisons amid COVID, post-COVID, for preparing for the next pandemic. How do you mitigate? How do you protect inmates and workforce? There are prisons that are coming up. There's a prison construction in Salt Lake City and one in Denver. I just read a piece in Architectural Digest the other day that says they are being constructed with, to the extent that they can, distance in mind. I don't know if Deanna or John or Vikrant, is it Vikrant or Vikrant? How do you pronounce your name?
It is Vikrant.
Vikrant. I knew we were butchering it somehow, but if y'all know anything about that landscape, if you can weigh in. So there's that. I'm going to give all my ideas and y'all can jump in. The other, Chandra Whitfield, one of the journalist fellows, had a question that didn't get answered, and it was this: are there disparities in the number of persons of color with mental illness who wind up in the system versus whites? And I asked that question in light of this reality. More people of color have sought mental health care in this country amid COVID than at any other time. And so my question as a journalist would be, if you have a mental illness diagnosis when you become justice involved, how does that affect your treatment? And if you don't have a diagnosis but have a mental illness, how does that shape your interaction with the courts, with cops, etc.? The other, that program that Emily Kleeman is doing in Denver, that level of reentry doesn't exist in many places. And it raises the whole issue of, one, how women approach reentry and what the needs of women are. Women as this fastest growing proportionately population of justice involved people, how what they need may be different. My last idea, we had a formerly incarcerated woman who had been convicted of murder at a regional conference we did in Florida last year or year before last. She talked about how hard it was to pay all the fines and fees of her post-incarceration. And I'm wondering, at a time when people are coming out of prison, the job market is a mess for everybody, particularly the unskilled and all of that, but what the cost of post-incarceration, of reentry is right now, and how people are paying that, and if they're winding back up in the system when they can't pay. So those are my 4 or 5 ideas, and I'm
So,
out.
Vikrant, before you answer that, I wanted to, since Katti brought up.
No, would you pronounce your name again? I'm sorry.
It's Vikrant,
Vikrant.
right?
Vikrant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got
So,
it. All right.
since Katti brought up Chandra, and Chandra's been doing a lot of interesting stuff. She's one of our fellows. Chandra, if I can impose on you, because I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator to just call on you, because everybody else seems very shy. Chandra, if you're still there, I'm going to allow you to talk and to talk a little bit about what you were getting at with that question and how that fits into some of the stories you're thinking about. You don't have to be specific, but it would give us, everyone else, some idea of the troubles and the challenges that you're running into. If you're there, are you there? You're on the list.
Hey, Steve, if I may jump in with a quick question if you don't get to hers.
Yeah, I'm trying to get her to. There you go. But go ahead. Go ahead. While we're waiting for Chandra to come on, if she's there.
Sure. Here's a question for everyone here, and it has to do with news coverage and the criminal justice system. The good news is more information is being provided to the public. They know more about the criminal justice system than ever before. There seems a little bit of a danger that the coverage oftentimes, and this is maybe unavoidable, covers the abnormalities or the instances of injustice, the problems with the system. But there are not many stories, justice was done in courtroom 2 today. And I'm wondering about, is there any danger in not, in covering in detail all the system's failures without providing context of those situations where, guess what, law enforcement did something great or did their job, or the courts convicted somebody who deserved to be convicted, and how that affects perceptions of legitimacy in the public on which the entire system depends. So let me throw that out to the panel.
Go ahead and answer that. I'm still waiting. I don't think Chandra is. She's on the list, but she may have stepped away. So go ahead and answer that.
Well, yeah, I can say, Erik, I think that is a danger. I don't have any easy solutions to it. John and Deanna both spoke very eloquently about the sort of if it bleeds, it leads nature of journalism, right? They run with very sensational stories that, that's what kind of drives readership interest. To some extent, I don't blame the journalists. I blame all of us because we click on that stuff. We read that stuff. They're responding to those incentives. But I do worry about that a lot, that positive things are happening in criminal justice, and we don't talk about them enough. And if we don't talk about them, we're not going to learn how to replicate those kinds of things. I'll give you a really simple example. New York, sometimes people talk about as this kind of awful policing cesspool. I mean, I just told the Erik Garner story myself, right? But the truth is actually that New York over the last several decades has seen a significant drop in violent crime and a significant decrease in incarceration. Has actually seen a decrease in racial disparities among the incarcerated population. Here's the biggest thing of all, I think. A few years ago, New York really scaled back its stop and frisk program. And a lot of sort of, quote unquote, tough on crime people warned that, oh gosh, now you're going to watch New York turn into Gotham City. That did not happen. When stop and frisk ended, it turned out that New York, year after year after year, now this is until 2020, which, it's unique for reasons that John mentioned in his opening remarks, and we still don't have a handle on what happened in 2020. But before that, for several years, even after stop and frisk had been scaled back, the crime rate in New York continued to fall. Man, this is amazing. There are things that were done in New York, supposedly, that you might be able to replicate in other cities that would get these kinds of results, that would mean less deprivation of people's liberties on a day-to-day basis, less incarceration, lower crime rates. This is what everybody wants. And I don't claim to know exactly what New York got right over several years there, and many other states and cities were doing effective things also. Crime rates have been falling, for 20 years, more or less, before 2020. There have been some positive things, and I have to throw this in there. I don't mean to make it sound like everything is hunky-dory. We have some significant criminal justice problems in this country. That's why we're having this panel today. And we want to address those problems, but the way to address those problems, in part, is to figure out what is actually working and what can we copy and what can we replicate that is actually going well. But it seems like it is tough sometimes to report on that stuff and therefore prompt policy conversations about that stuff.
Yes, I see Tim there. Tim, go ahead and speak.
Hey, Stephen, how are you? Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone. This is really a wonderful dialogue. And I have about 75 story ideas from the 3 weeks. So I'll have to sift through them. But on the most recent question you're discussing, I'm kind of fascinated by the idea that there are positive stories that aren't being told. And I would probably agree. I think there's a challenge. I can tell you that when I watch local news and I see that they are covering, police officers saw some kids playing basketball and they went to play basketball with them. I want to vomit, because I'm like, that's not really helping anybody. The police departments have perfectly good PR firms working for them. We don't really need that. But I agree. And I go back to John's point that there are blue ribbon panels that come out with systemic suggestions. And I think that they should be covered if they're not. And I actually do think they're covered on the journalist side. I think it would be wrong, of course, not to have a follow-up story. You look at Boeing, how did they approve a plane that killed people, right? Definitely a systemic story. You need a follow-up about if anybody at Boeing is going to go to prison for that, right? You need both. So I'm hoping we're doing both and not just the one.
Can I turn something back onto the panelists? I mean, in this time of sort of newsrooms getting smaller and smaller, there is a tremendous reliance in good newsrooms on informed, referenced op-ed writers. So maybe y'all need to do more writing and that kind of thing.
So I'm going to suggest this panel has. But I think that
more.
Well, there's only so many hours in the day when you're trying to run a school, but I take your point. Let me add one thing to this conversation here, which is really quite interesting. So Erik, I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit on the premise. The criminal justice system gets covered every single day in every media market in the country. And the presumption is most time on those stories that they're getting it right. So most times, if it bleeds, it leads. There's a picture of someone being arrested. The presumption is this must have been the guy. Fast forward to the courthouse. There's someone there in an orange jumpsuit who is almost assuredly going to be convicted, because we know what conviction rates are once you're inside a courtroom. Again, the presumption is that person is guilty and the system worked. Now, this isn't a love and roses story about how terrific it is that the system's working, but the presumption is in most of those stories that the person is guilty, the system got it right. We don't hear, the police arrested him, but there are questions about whether the eyewitness correctly saw him and whether he was forced into a confession. So the other stories, the wrongful conviction stories and the like, are really man bites dog stories. The difficulty in the good news stories, if you will, about how the system has been innovative and brought crime down and saved money and prevented the innocent from being convicted, is you need a hook. And what's the hook? So I think from a reporter's perspective, most of the time the hook is, what's the crime rate look like this year? Or is there some payout of money and some sort of response as a result of that? Otherwise, you all have to go looking for these stories, or we have to bring them to you. But then you got to convince an editor that this is really something that people are going to want to read about. And there aren't good news hooks, I think, on many of the what we're calling good news stories here.
Thanks, John. One of the things that I have actually connected, and I apologize to any journalist, is that news is starting to be like reality TV to me, right? And I know, Katti, but the reason
then you're not consuming enough news from different places, because it's amazing.
And maybe that's it, because in my local area, when I look at my local news to try to figure out what's going on, it's very chaotic, right? And my first question when John said the news is arresting, they just arrested a 14-year-old accused right? So there's this presumption. That's the first thing I went to, the presumption of innocence, the presumption of why a 14-year-old would get involved in his life. But it's always the dehumanization or the guilty of a person. And when you're in this system and you know how the system sometimes gets it wrong, you're always questioning those initial arrests when the rest of society doesn't. So I'm kind of with John in a way. How do we tell those good stories? How do we tell how the system is changing, but keep it newsworthy to individuals while removing that chaotic? And when Katti said we need to write more op-eds, we do write a lot of op-eds. The problem is we're not celebrity status around criminal justice and the work we're doing. So a lot of outlets don't pick it up. So if you know another strategy or a way, I would love to talk to you after this.
Deanna, you're pretty much a celebrity. I think that you qualify.
And I want to raise this too. I also think
Katti,
another
before you do,
story.
I've got Felicia Fonseca on the line. She's got to say something. So
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Felicia, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks everyone. I guess I'm sort of like in a fortunate position where I am with the Associated Press is because I don't pay attention to what everyone else is covering. I want to know what is happening in the most rural parts of Arizona and Indian country, where is a constant struggle to try to get any information about what's happening in criminal justice systems or in tribal jails. And it's a position that requires a lot of patience and kind of waiting and like building up sources pretty heavily to even get a little bit of information. So I think maybe someone had talked in the webinar series about, we don't write about, I think it was Fred Urbina who talked about, we don't write about children who go missing in Indian country. And there was a case in New Mexico not too long ago about Ashlyn Mike, which was a girl who got lured into a van along with her brother, and she ended up being raped and killed. But there were so many things to look at that, like just to drill back and say, how did this happen? Well, the tribe had money for an Amber Alert system that never got used because they didn't have matching funds for the system that were provided by the federal government. And what happened just personality wise within the police departments to where that didn't come about, where they have a system. And because the tribe is within 3 states, which state is responsible for even sending out Amber Alerts for this tribe? So when people talk about, here's the action that happened, and we covered the criminal aspects of it, but there were so many things to drill back and say, how did this happen, right? And I think a lot of that is going to go into like missing and murdered, when we talk about how is it that people are just flying under the radar? Why don't we know more about what happens in Indian country? How can we hold the FBI accountable for the work that it does? And if they do solve cases, why don't they want to talk about it, right? Criminal jurisdiction people talked about, and that's really hard because it's the same thing almost with wildfires, right? You're struggling to figure out who has jurisdiction over this and where's my first call, and if tribal police are the initial responders, who's going to take over next? Is it the state? Is it the BIA? Is it the FBI? So I think we should be looking more at rural areas. And I know, there are way more than enough people within the AP paying attention to the big trials of the world. But I like to look in the far-flung areas and kind of hear about why don't we know about this? Why don't communities know when a crime is happening within their community? And if federal officials or state officials tout some, big task force in which they've arrested lots of people, do they go back and tell the community, what happens next? There are a lot of cases where we cover, the arrest of, gangs in Indian country, and these community members are still afraid. They're saying, okay, they got arrested, but how do we know when they're going to come out, and what's going to happen to us if we say something about the lack of law enforcement in our communities? But
that raises a key problem, is sourcing. How do we get to the people we really need to talk to? I don't know how easy it is for any of the other fellows in the room about getting the right people to talk to and getting them to talk to you to begin with. Nikki Roberts, I think is your hand up? Were you still thinking about?
Yes, just really quickly. And to your point, Stephen, like who is controlling these narratives? Yes. And I, again, as a justice involved media advocate, it's so interesting to hear the accounts, very similar to the African proverb that until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter. So I've had prison officials speak highly of how great I was and how compliant and how great, but I have a different story to tell, right? And so, so often we idealize these dominant narratives and we don't include, again, the perspective of someone with that lived experience. And I just think that there's space for all parties to promote and do their public relations, as it's been said on this call, but for there to also be more lived experiences, more direct narrative accounts, first-person accounts, to affirm systemic research. I think that's a way forward, and I'm just glad to be in this space. And again, I'm full of a lot of story ideas too. I think we are all multiple stories. And so I just encourage everyone to not be dismissive of utilizing your voice from your social unit, because I think that's a missing piece that deserves a pause and action. So thank you all.
Katti, I didn't want to cut you off, so you wanted to come in here?
I don't remember. I don't remember what I was gonna. I do want to offer this context. I mean, and this is, and y'all know this. The sort of loss of local newsrooms. I mean, there's so much going on in the industry that's made all of our work more difficult. And I'm speaking, now as someone who, I work with Steve part-time. I'm a freelancer. I'm a hustler, and so I'm starting editing. Frankly, at the Center for Sustainable Journalism, and so, which is heavily reliant on op-ed writers. And in this sphere, I think one of the things that has always struck me is that so much of the narrative is driven, even in the nonprofit realm, by white people whose cousin ain't never been to prison and who ain't never been to prison. And I think one of the challenges for journalists is that we begin to perhaps not always go to the Vera Institute and these sort of places that stay in the headlines and become easy for us to rely on because they're always in the headlines. I think that there is a on the ground, and Felicia, I know you were getting to that. There is an on the ground approach to this work as a journalist that makes all the difference in fully contextualizing the stories and frankly, getting different stories. And, we've tried, even at this conference, like Andy Potter is in my Rolodex. He's a former corrections officer with an in and a perspective that we also need to have. I find often even the fellows who come to these conferences, like I'm a straight ahead, I'm a nappy headed Black chick from the South End of Little Rock, but I am a straight ahead journalist when it comes to my work, because I think reporting my work outside of myself is what lends credibility to my work. I think criminal justice journalists every once in a while sort of veer on the side of cheerleading, and that's not my job, no matter what I feel personally. So I'm just rambling and I'm going to shut up now.
Go ahead and jump in. Anybody else who wants to come in on it?
Yeah, I wanted to build on that a little bit, because when we're talking about going into these rural areas, I mean, I've had a number of times where people say, how do I know that you're not connected with the drug dealers that were just arrested and you're just calling me for information, right?
Who tells you that?
That's a real call that I made on the story that I did about gang violence on the Navajo Nation and wanting to talk about the community impact. How do you feel now that the FBI has said they've arrested all the key players in this gang, and they say, I don't know you. I don't know if you're one of their cousins. I don't know if they're going to come back. I don't know if you're trying to get information about where I live, who I am, to send somebody after me. So part of what's important about going into rural communities is that there's a not as deep of an understanding about what happens when this story comes out, right? What is going to happen? Where is my name going to be thrown around? What are you going to do with this? So whenever reporters ask, how do you cover rural communities? You have to be ready to justify why you're doing the work that you're doing. And what is the benefit to this community from talking to you, and be more explanatory in your process of reporting stories than you would with people who, speak to the media every day, with elected officials, with politicians, whatnot. And I think that's really important. And you need to be willing to send everyone who is in your stories a copy of that story, whether it's a link or you need to clip it out from the newspaper, put it in an envelope and mail it to them.
Erik?
You know, Felicia, I was,
Vikrant.
I'm sorry. I wanted to say, I cannot tell you how much I agree with Felicia. I have watched this very thing myself. I have this memory from a couple of years ago that has just always stuck with me. It was when I toured some criminal justice facilities in Native American country up in South Dakota. And it was a really interesting day. And I talked to a whole bunch of people. And the thing that really stood out that seemed so bizarre to me, but which makes all the sense in the world when you think about it, is that regular folks on this land up in South Dakota, they can name one after the other treaties that were violated by the United States with Native Americans. They have these treaties memorized. This is the kind of information that I would think only Jeopardy champions know in the normal world. But you go out to South Dakota and Native American communities up there, they know they can rattle these things off the way that I rattle off the players on the Dallas Cowboys roster. They've just got them all committed to memory. And there is a deep, deep distrust of all large, major American institutions whenever you walk into this part of the world. You know, that's a microcosm of probably a broader distrust of institutions that's happening all over the globe, you know, connects to things like Brexit and the Arab Spring, et cetera, et cetera. But you can really, really feel it, I think, in Native American communities, because for them, it's not something new that has erupted because of social media or whatever. It is something that they felt for decades. I don't have an easy solution to that other than just probably the shoe leather work of building relationships and talking to people and listening to their stories and writing about them. That takes time, it takes resources, it's not easy, but I can't second what Felicia observed enough. I've observed the very same thing, the huge distrust.
You're muted, Steve.
Erik had a question, and then I want to move to Chandra, who's got her hand up.
You bet. Just kind of a general question to the group. The fourth estate has filled many roles, of course, with regards to the criminal justice system. I'm wondering if the past few years, accentuated by the BLM movement, by the COVID consequences for criminal justice, whether there has been a change in the roles for journalism or a new emphasis. And also you include that, as Stephen mentioned, the wrongful conviction phenomenon and similar concerns. Whether the role of a journalist and maybe even a local journalist has changed given these kind of seismic movements in the criminal justice system.
That's a fascinating question. Chandra, maybe I'll ask you to first speak to that, and then I'll ask the others.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had a comment that I just wanted to add in. One, I just wanted to encourage the journalists to pursue those stories. And I think it's getting harder and harder to get some of those stories, done. But for me, journalism fellowships, which is interesting because this is a fellowship as well, the more project-based fellowships tend to be a great outlet to doing the more in-depth treatment. So I just encourage you to, go out, get funded, and get some, resources to do the more in-depth reporting. So don't just not do it because your newsroom is not willing to invest. And the second part, this was just related to earlier stuff, so I just wanted to make sure I got that out. But I just wanted to say, as far as the challenge about doing these types of stories, I would just say, I don't tell people, oh, go give me a like or go, do this. But I think we all have to remember that journalism, like anything else, is a business. And if you do some of these more in-depth stories and you want more of the stories that we talked about, you need to tell people, if you like this type of story, share it, share it on your social media, share it in your networks, because at the end of the day, they're going to get more coverage if they get the likes, the clicks, or, the audience. So you, to some degree, have to be really proactive with saying, hey, if you want more positive stories, I need you to share this and let people, let the newsroom see this is the type of stuff that I want to see. I don't want to see, the doom and gloom that we see, or the stories that we see out of context on, say, the local news or whatever. So I just wanted to add those words of encouragement to the journalists to keep pressing, but also, be proactive with telling people if they want these types of stories, they have to demonstrate in numbers that these stories are successful, because journalism is also a business and they want to see success as well.
Well, we obviously couldn't agree more. I think one of the philosophies we have in doing these conferences is that we believe good stories beget good stories. And once people start writing something, your city editor, your assignment editor sees someone else doing it, he or she is going to want more of that from you. And the whole point of developing these networks and our fellowships and others is to encourage people to go take risks and do stories that you might not ordinarily want to do or might be outside of your comfort zone. And then you find that lots of other people are following you. So that might answer in part Eric's question, but anyone else who wants to pop in, I know Paul Ingram has a few things he wants to say as well. So if anyone wants to answer Erik first, or Paul, if you want to, go ahead.
I want to, oh, go ahead, Paul. I'm sorry.
I wanted to answer Eric's question because I think it's a really interesting one. Especially I think for local journalists. I mean, for me, I've always done a lot of immigration reporting, which always has the Border Patrol puts out a narrative of what happened, and that sometimes that completely falls apart. There was two trials that I spent a lot of time reporting on, and it was very clear how much the original narrative was just completely wrong. And so one of the things I think is really would be good for local journalists to really pay attention to is that when the police put out a release, to treat it as a source, but not to treat it as the source, the story, as more of a start, and then go and really try to find out. We did a lot of work on reporting, which you mentioned about the Sentinel event, which is the death of Carlos Ingram Lopez. And, that was really the sense that, not only did the police were in the middle of investigating, and then they were in the middle of kind of, okay, what do we do about this? And we feel like we kind of kicked off their admission of that they had been, spent weeks on investigating this, and then finally had to show us the video, and we knew about it early and did some reporting about it, to really be thoughtful about what police agencies are telling you, not because you want to distrust them per se, but that maybe their narratives are just wrong, and to start treating them as a source rather than as the single source for certain things, and to make sure that we do follow-ups. That's probably, I think, the biggest thing in the last year, is to really think about those things in those terms of how these stories get put forward and whether or not we do follow-ups. We really need to do more follow-ups. Every single time we report on a crime story, we need to say, okay, what happened? Who got prosecuted? How did that happen? What was the case actually like? What do the reports look like? And really think about those things to make sure we're not just putting out there, this person did this thing, and that's the end of it, because that's never the end of it.
Thank you, Paul. So we have about 10 minutes left on our schedule. So what I wanted to do is maybe go around to our first three speakers and ask them if they want to sum up and comment on some of the comments they've heard, and then we can close. Perhaps Deanna, we'll go for you first, and Vikrant, and then maybe John.
Trying to get my thoughts together and hoping you was going in reverse this time, Steve.
Well, that's fine. Who's ready to speak first, Vikrant or John?
I can say a few things, but not in the way of summing up. I was just jotting down all these questions. We've had such a robust discussion. People have asked questions that are just dangling out there that haven't been addressed. And if you don't mind, real quickly, as fast as I can, I'm going to go over some of them, because I think I have a few thoughts. First, let me address Erik's question about whether or not the role of journalists has changed. My short answer is no, I don't think so. And to the extent that journalists think their role has changed, that might be the problem. Katti said something a moment ago that I really liked, where she said that, she tries very hard not to be a cheerleader. That's key. You really have to try not to take sides. It's impossible not to let bias kind of leak in here and there. People are human beings. But to the extent that journalists have looked around, seen a story and said, this is truly appalling, I'm going to take a side and write from that side, I think that's probably something that has contributed to a decline of trust in journalists and in journalism. So my response, Erik, is I don't think that the role has changed, and I think journalism will be stronger if journalists internalize that. Another thing that came up was something that Tim said, this is a while back. He was mentioning the example of Boeing and saying, we have these situations where airplanes will crash, but the big question is, will some executive get punished? And I really like the idea of transferring this idea to the criminal justice system and to policing in particular. There's going to be some level of failure in the criminal justice system. It's a huge, vast system. It's never going to be 100% correct. But I think what people want to see and what they're getting frustrated by is that when they see errors, they're not seeing accountability for those errors. And this goes to things, for example, like the qualified immunity question. I'll tell you, I come from Texas. People may have intuited this from the Dallas Cowboys comment earlier. There was an appalling story involving qualified immunity, I think just 2 weeks ago, near where I grew up in Arlington, where the Cowboy Stadium is located, in fact. This man, forget his first name, his last name is Olivas. He was having some kind of a mental episode, and he had doused himself in gasoline and started threatening that he was going to set himself and the entire home, he doused the home in gasoline too, on fire. So his family called the police showed up. They're standing here in Arlington, Texas. They're looking at this man who's covered in gasoline. The whole home is covered in gasoline. He's holding a match and he's threatening to blow everything up. And they're in a tough spot because what you would ordinarily do in a situation like this to immobilize this person who's a danger to himself is you just use the taser. You can't use the taser on this man because he's covered in gasoline. You're going to set him on fire. Now, this is a tough problem in the sense that if you do nothing, there's a 99% chance that he's going to light that match and he's going to light himself on fire. But here's the thing. If you shoot the taser, there's a 100% chance that he's going to light on fire and that the whole home is going to burn down and he's going to die. The police officers fired the taser. And of course, the inevitable happened. He died and his estate is, they sued the police department because of the actions that the police officers took. Went to court and the court granted qualified immunity. It was the Fifth Circuit overturned the lower court and granted qualified immunity. And it's because the weird way that the law works, basically, without getting into all the details, they ask whether or not there was some kind of similar precedent in the books. There wasn't. So the argument was, well, the cops couldn't have possibly known what to do. We'll grant them immunity here. This kind of thing happens over and over and over again. That is a doctrine that really, really needs to be revised. That's something journalists should be looking at. But I think it hits at Tim's key question about accountability in the system and people being desperate for accountability. The last thing I'll say is something Katti mentioned about prisons incorporating more space. I think I got the idea right, Katti. This is something you were talking about. I don't know a lot about this, but I'll simply say that I took this tour of prisons in Europe that really kind of struck me because, the prisons they're just more spacious. There's more light. And those kinds of things matter in terms of mental health outcomes. I believe that incarceration is necessary at some level and has some role in our criminal justice system. But that doesn't mean that the prisons have to be dungeons, right? As long as you have the deprivation of liberty and as long as you're doing things to rehabilitate and correct inside the prisons, that's more important than just making them as dark and inhumane as you possibly can. So I wanted to offer that thought on Katti's question. I think I hit three that I really wanted to get to.
A lot of corrections people in the U.S. took that tour. I'm not sure it was with you, and they came back, particularly from Scandinavia and Germany, with a whole new perspective. And it's slowly, that's a story, I think you're right, that's slowly becoming, emerging as something that's worth covering, changing the environment of prisons themselves. We haven't got there yet. It takes a lot of money, but that's a slowly emerging story. John, I want to go to you for wrap-up comments, and then I'll go to Deanna.
All right, well, I am going to be a cheerleader. And I'm actually going to be a cheerleader for the journalists on this call. When I was back in high school, I took one of those vocational interest surveys, and it turns out I should have been a journalist according to that. I have tremendous respect for the work that you're doing. It is difficult, it is poorly paid, but my God, it's exciting and it's interesting. So thank you for doing the work that you're doing and looking into these stories. Quickly to answer Erik's call or question, I don't think the role of journalist has changed, but I think who counts as a journalist has changed. If I simply look at who I'm getting emails from and who I get phone calls from, it's not as much the network news. That may just be because this isn't a face for television, but it's also not traditional newspapers. It's the Marshall Project, it's ProPublica, it's a number of other organizations that hold themselves out as investigative journalists. So I think who we're talking about is a much bigger group of people, but I think the exercise is still the same. The last thing I would say is it's terrific that so many of you have been here over the last 3 weeks to get some more story ideas and talk about your own thoughts. One thing that I don't see journalists do as much as I think they might is almost all of you work in an area with a very good university that's either right there in the city you're in or somewhere nearby. For a cup of coffee, and frankly, the faculty member will probably pay for it anyhow. Invite someone back at some point when we're able to be back in person again. Invite someone out for a cup of coffee, someone who studies this stuff. Ask them for their 5 to 10 top stories in their area that they think ought to be covered. We in the Academy love to hear ourselves talk, but actually occasionally we do have something worthwhile hearing, and then you have ready-made sources for you that you can turn to in your area. So that's the last pitch I will make from the academic side, and we'll close by once again thanking you all for doing the work, and then thanking the organizers for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, John. Deanna, you do have the last word.
So I just want to wrap up and say that to journalists, having people who have been directly impacted as part of your source can be huge in getting a different perspective and a different story. When we spoke about the Germany trip, and we directors of Department of Corrections are visiting, then coming back trying to correct their correctional facility, but we're not taking elected officials to address the policies that Germany have that play into why their prisons are housed that way, or how after 5 years, everyone has to be reevaluated for release and rehabilitation. So it's two roles in that the facility operates in this way, but it's some Germany policies that actually make sure that those facilities operate in a human perspective and maintaining human dignity as well. And so we haven't been taking our elected officials on those tours as well in partnership with the DLC director. I think Mississippi kind of did it in conjunction, elected officials and DLC, to start addressing some of those policies. But I think it's really important. Katti spoke about the new prisons being constructed and creating more space. If we're creating our policies that actually focus on alternatives to incarceration, we don't need huge facilities. Our facilities won't get overcrowded. So actually reducing the ability, what New York has done very well, New York has passed policies that at one time, New York City was incarcerating 22,000 people on Rikers Island. So that means they had the capacity. Even with the passing of bail reform, the passing of closing Rikers and building smaller facilities, it is reducing the city's ability to ever incarcerate at that level again, and only saying you'll only be able to incarcerate 4,000 people at any given time, but constantly pushing criminal justice alternatives to incarceration. So I don't think defund the police is a weird thing. I think the language that we use is really building communities, investing in communities, instead of defaulting to corrections or incarceration as a solution. Actually building communities that have access to mental health, that has access to substance abuse and different things of that nature is really what defunds the police means, but it also starts to build the infrastructure in place where when that individual who set himself in gasoline, there should have been mental health consultants that was able to go on that scene with police, but also how the news reports it and how journalists reports it as, instead of this is what this guy was doing from a criminal justice perspective, how about the lack of mental health access and services in this community that could have addressed some of those issues as well, is how we have to talk. So I guess my cry or my ask of the journalists, I've been taught never to leave a panel without an ask, is actually really focusing on journalism from a solution-based perspective. You're on mute.
You're on mute, Steve.
Doing that. So thank you, Deanna. We are just about at the end of our time. It's been a long day. It's been a long journey, but we're not done with you guys yet, because we'll continue to work with you as you need it and put on more resources and on our conference page. So I hope you'll pay attention to that. And I want to, of course, end with a special thank you, a shout out to the Academy for Justice at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at ASU for making this possible. So thank you, Erik. It's been a great ride. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I also want to say thank you to Katti for helping us, for organizing this. We couldn't have done it without you. And special shout out to both Michael Gelb, our intern, and Christopher Graham, who is our technical producer, who's made this all go so smoothly. And being a webinar and not a personal virtual, non-virtual event, it's a little bit different than because we don't see you, we can't shake your hands. We may never again be able to shake hands again, but it's been I think, a productive 3 weeks and a series of webinars. And I hope most of all that it leads to stories, to ideas that you might have. And as I said, we are here and available for you with any questions. And as I said at the beginning, please send us your stories and links to your stories. We'll be happy to cross-post them and certainly link them on our conference page. So once again, thanks for staying with us. Thanks to our panelists in this panel, Vikrant, Deanna, and John, and our facilitators. And I hope you all have a great, great weekend. So thanks, everyone. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Farewell.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Bye now.